It's about xenophobia in Ukraine and how revolution of dignity and further Russian aggression influenced ethnic relations in Ukraine. And we'll hear Vyacheslav Likhachev, who is head of the monitoring group on national minorities' rights.
Briefing dedicated to the following topic: xenophobia in Ukraine. How did the revolution of dignity and further Russian aggression influence on the inter-ethnic relations in Ukraine? And our speaker will be Vyacheslav Likhachev, who is the head of the Minority Rights Monitoring Group. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I thank the Crisis Media Center for the invitation. Sorry, I'll be speaking Russian. I'm not the citizen of Ukraine. Of course, I understand and can reply in Ukrainian, but I'll talk in Russian. What I wanted to tell you and why I think this is important. Over the last decade, I've been involved with a program about the work on the hate crimes in Ukraine within the framework of the Congress of National Communities of Ukraine. What we mean by hate crimes and what this monitoring is. And I'll tell you about the results a bit later, why I think this is very important now. And we are intensifying this work, having made it more institutionally developed. We created a special task group on the monitoring of the rights of national minorities, because at the moment this topic, which is narrow and does present a special interest in the Ukrainian society, however, it is not among the major problems. The events connected with the juxtaposition of the previous regime and protest movement and the following Russian intervention made this topic one of the top ones on the agenda of world discussion of the processes going on in Ukraine. In particular, this was so because of the logic of information war and propaganda campaign that the previous regime waged against the protest movement, and then this was taken to a qualitatively new level by the Russian authorities in order to legitimize the interference into Ukrainian affairs. It was very beneficial for the former authorities to paint the Ukrainian protest movement as fascist, Banderite, and so on. And the topic of xenophobia became very important for the authorities because this is the general logic of juxtaposition of authorities to protest movements. It is necessary to show protest movements as extremist, as threatening to the rights, to human rights, because in the world, you know, there is a very touchy issue, and of course, they do not tolerate any escapades against the national minorities and anti-Semitism, of course. And if you paint the image of anti-Semitism and fascism, then it is very much easier to paint and to justify repressions against the protest movement. So there were special campaigns, especially oriented on to reach international opinion, international community. I know this quite well because we investigated how these campaigns were built. And after Russia has started to participate in spinning this topic, it became rather prominent in the international mass media. out of proportion with the real significance of national radicals in the protest movement and the number of incidents, and I'll dwell on this. So a number of incidents during the protest movement we see as artificial provocations that were staged in order to discredit the protest movement. It is connected to anti-Semitic incidents and some attacks. So in response to the situation with the information and propaganda campaign that we have to oppose, we started to more intensively, including from the point of information strategy, to conduct our work. So we set up a special group. The situation has changed a bit now. During the most crisis-prone moment, we were issuing reports every week. We think that this helped to balance the picture, but as I think I'm not in Ukraine now, and I'm in the center of the world information process, but we think I have an image, an impression that in Ukraine they do not understand how this problem is important, not only because of the image of Ukraine in the world, but also the domestic problems or quintessential problems of Ukrainian society that wants to build a European model of socium, including interethnic relations that mean the entirely different standard of attention towards this problem on the part of society. I do not think that the strategy of total rejection of the presence of racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia is right. I think that the adequate response to discrediting campaigns is the maximally precise monitoring of what is really happening and honest narration about what's happening, because the problem is there. This is about the current information context and why I think this issue is very important. So now about hate crimes, how our monitoring works, and about some of its results. As a hate crime, we regard, proceeding from the OSCE standards, such crimes which are motivated by race, national, religious, and other ideological intolerance, when the basis for instance, physical violence or for vandalism acts is the attitude towards a group to which a victim belongs. Not just personal relations, not material benefit, but the ideological hatred towards people based on their color of skin, religious affiliation, to communities based on their religion. And periodically, well, you know, I started in 2002 from the monitoring of anti-Semitism, from 2006 when the problem of Ukrainian, race hatred became more topical. We deployed a series of monitoring about the acts of vandalism, about physical violence, some national cultural centers, against memorials to the Holocaust victims, against Jewish or Muslim cemeteries, or more or less acute relations between different religious denominations that sometimes acquire the form of xenophobic. But because I represent an organization of national minorities, we first of all were monitoring race and national hatred crimes. We are not in the position to monitor in a broader sense, like, for instance, physical violence on the grounds of homophobia or some social strata. But as far as national hatred is concerned, we have more information than anyone else, not just our organization, but our partners like the International Migration Organization, the project Without Borders of the Center of Social Activities. This is a consortium of public organizations where we assume the role of coordinator. Using the criteria accepted in Europe, we rather strictly monitor what allows us to say that this was a hate crime. For the what I will be talking about is not the general number of attacks against dark-colored people, dark-colored skinned people, or Jews or Crimean Tatars. This is about the cases when we have enough information to pronounce this a hatred, ideological hatred crime. As you understand, we do not always collect enough information, and what I'll be talking about is probably 1/3 out of the general number of information about such attacks, but we either cannot check the data, or we think that the hate motive is not corroborated, or we just don't have enough information to say that it was a hate crime. But we are almost 100% sure about every case that makes it to our statistics. So you should understand this is not the general number of crimes on the grounds of racial hatred in the country, but this is what we are sure about. And in reality, this is not so few. State bodies do not produce such statistics, and the only statistics that state bodies produce is the statistics of court cases, which is absolutely inadequate because this article almost cannot be applied, and the fingers of one hand will be enough to enumerate the cases when such cases make it to the court. Even when the president addressed the prosecutor general's office and the Ministry of Interior to pay special attention to such crimes, he had to use as foundation the statistics that I provide. So what about the figures and the scale of the problem? And for the correlation, we'll look at the dynamics over the last years, and we'll also compare the situation to comparable countries. And I'll finish with urgent problems. The systemic monitoring was launched in 2006 when we started to get more and more information about racist attacks. This was due to special dynamics within the Ukrainian society, with some migration processes and with internal processes taking place in youth neo-Nazi subcultures, because most of all those who are engaged in these attacks are fascist subcultures like skinheads, football fans, and a special critical mass became ripe in Ukraine of aggressive youth who practice such attacks. And for you to understand about the nature of the crimes, often or as a rule are targeted attacks of a group of young people with knives, iron rods, traumatic weapons, gas sprays. They were especially going to evening streets to find some people who are of non-Slavic, non-Ukrainian, non-white appearance, and to inflict maximally possible physical injuries on their victims. As a rule, or well, often they wanted to maim or kill this victim. This was not a crime to steal a mobile phone. In 2006, when we started to see this rise in wave, we saw 14 victims, because we count not the number of attacks but the number of victims. 14 cases in 2006, and 2 people died as a result of these attacks. From the end of 2006, the number of such attacks started to rise sharply. In 2007, we saw 88 such cases, and 7 people died. In 2008, we saw the edge of this wave, 84 over the 2008, and 4 people died. But more than half of those cases and all who died were the first 3 months of 2008. After this, and I please myself with the hope that as a result of our efforts as well, the law enforcers started to pay attention to these problems. By the end of 2007, they created a special department in the State Security Service. Even a bit earlier, the Ministry of Interior started to look especially into this. So from the spring of 2008, including due to repressive police methods, this wave started to abate. In 2009, we talk only about 37, and praise the God, no one died. However, from 2010, the dynamics has changed again. Under the new president, Viktor Yanukovych, the special departments at the State Security Service and the Ministry of Interior were disbanded. The dialogue with the civil society stopped, and as you know, the authorities started to create so-called pocket public councils, and in 2010 we saw 18 attacks and 1 person was killed. In 2011, 54 cases of attacks. In 2012, again less, 19 cases. But then, you know, this was explained by internal processes within this neo-Nazi subculture, which on the one hand meant the lessening of number of racist crimes, but on the other hand, they meant potential problems that become more and more urgent over the last 2 years, and they are forming the agenda now that the Ukrainian society has to deal with this. Besides, in 2012, there was a football championship when, by police methods, this youth aggressive activity was quashed by police methods, so the problem was frozen. In the 2013, we saw 12 such cases, and now the situation has changed, starting from the spring of 2013, when the administration of the president decided to use a political technological scheme of painting the image of the opposition as fascist, xenophobic. The power started to initiate xenophobic attacks that had to be responsibility had to be shifted to some groupings, and then the image spread to all the opposition, and to make the methods of administration of the president the methods that were to be used by the authorities to win next elections. The juxtaposition became even more acute during Maidan.
I know exactly that the next financing for information campaign was allocated by the presidential administration at the day when the laws on dictatorship were passed. That was a framework strategy, and the authorities were trying to create the image of opposition and to ensure that the way they will be dealing with the opposition is the proper one. And after the laws were passed, we fixed some of the very cruel anti-Semitic attacks in Kiev, and this has never happened before. And that was used in information strategy to create the image of the danger in the Jewish community. And then later we fixed many numbers of cases, like setting to fire synagogues by Molotov cocktails in Zaporozhye, the acts of vandalism in Simferopol the next day after Russian invasion started, in Odessa and some other cities. Unfortunately, we do not have all the information. In March, we saw another wave of anti-Semitic violence. Unfortunately, we cannot say that we have some successes in investigating these cases. We don't have enough information. But we believe that these incidents are provocations which were artificially instigated. Talking about the numbers that we have now, and I will finish my presentation by that. During the first 7 months of this year, we fixed, we fixed 23 cases of xenophobic violence on the territory controlled by the government of Ukraine. Because from the beginning of this year, we got this problem of the occupied territory of Crimea, where the topic of xenophobia is now at a different level, because Tatarophobia and Islamophobia have become part of the policy of Crimean authorities, and there were 2 cases of murder. One, the murder of Crimean Tatar, and we believe they are related to xenophobia. We have all this information about kidnapping. We have this long tradition of anti-Tatar and anti-Islamic propaganda within the Cossack detachments. So we know that many activists that were kidnapped and that were tortured, they were not killed, and they were finally liberated. But the fact that it was Crimean Tatar who was killed, I believe that this is enough grounds to say that that was the hate crime. And Crimean police officially classifies it as the death and the result of the traffic accident. And the second case, which is also interpreted as the traffic victim. And that was the case with the young man. I'm not 100% sure here because we don't have enough information, but I believe that these were 2 murders on the basis of national hatred. We fixed in Crimea and on occupied Donbas territories, we registered 14 incidents of racial hatred. In the eastern Ukraine, there's a problem with Roma population. We need to understand that the ideology of Russian radical nationalism is official in the terrorist organizations of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And we also need to understand one thing. Is it too many or too little? What does it mean? 20 cases, 30 cases, 80 cases? What does it look like compared to other countries? It's difficult to compare this situation with the situation in Western Europe because law enforcement bodies are fixing these crimes and because the Europeans pay attention to the problems of national minorities, they register even the minor incidents because in legal practices and the hate crimes are considered to be grave crimes, and there's more attention to such crimes than to some others. So that is why it's considered as violence, even if these are verbal threats, and even if that's the swastika painted on a car. But figures are different in Western Europe. In Russia, the public organizations work according to the same methodology as we do, and despite a different number of population in Russia, we can compare the facts here with the facts in Russia. In Russia, last year, the Savam Monitoring Center fixed 199 victims in the result of Russian violence. 21 were killed. According to the data of another center, 205 were victims and 25 were killed. In Ukraine last year we had 20 victims. In Russia the population is 3 times bigger, but the level of these crimes is 10 times bigger. So we cannot compare that we didn't have a single person killed in Ukraine in the period of the last 3 years, and 25 people who are killed in Russia every year. In this context, well, we see that the Russian political technologists are trying to create this image of the fascists in Kiev, but I believe that this data is what is so important to explain to the European and world community, because unfortunately, as I understand it, from the experience of I got in the West, in the Berlin, the Crimean propaganda is succeeding in the West, and so I believe that we need to correct this situation. But I believe that it will be not right to deny that fact that we do have this problem and all this volume of violence that we have in the result of the war, in the result of all these weapons which are in hands of people, and in the result of the legitimizing some of the neo-fascist groups which participated in the Revolution of Dignity. We can see that the situation is much worse compared to the previous year. This is the problem that the Ukrainian society will have to deal with, and this is the problem that has to attract more attention of the state bodies and of the public. If Ukrainian society is consistently creating the relations in this socium according to European model, as it is declared, and the Ukrainian society proved it's right to do so. I'm sorry for speaking so long, but I will try to answer your questions. Thank you. If you have any questions. Meanwhile, I have a question from the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. The events of the last 6 months forced all of us to look differently at some notions. The war, which is like the armed counterposition of two countries. Now we see that the war is the so-called hybrid war, but the number of victims is still huge. The same is true when we talk about interethnical relations. On the one hand, we have to be very careful when we are talking about tolerance to representatives of ethnic minorities, but also we have one ethnic group, Ukrainians, but every day there's a lot of information that some Ukrainians are not tolerant towards other Ukrainians. There are many reports from the places where the refugees moved to and from Transcarpathian. The village hosted the refugees from the east of Ukraine, but 2 days after, those people hoisted the Russian flag in the school there. So how should we act? Or how should we inform to reduce the risks of internal ethnical cases of intolerance or violence or any criminal
Of course, it's hard to tell in 2 words. I'll try to speak about my vision. I live in Israel and I'm a citizen of Israel. I understand that war is what's happening every day, and I am a pessimist about the current Ukrainian conflict. I do not see grounds to say that we will be able to swiftly localize the problem in the East. I'm afraid that the problem that Ukrainian society has faced for the first time now is the problem for a long time, and this is the foundation for the work of the Ukrainian society to minimize the problem that I think has ruined the country and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. As far as the formation and principle of the system of interethnic relations in Ukraine, these problematics for more than 20 years of Ukraine's independence was not the object of any concerted effort on the part of the state. I cannot agree with the allegation that we have just one Ukrainian nation. We have one Ukrainian civic nation. The declared principle that everyone who lives in Ukraine is Ukrainian does not hinder anyone from having another ethnic identity. And in Europe, while they are very attentive to the rights of ethnic minorities, they do not doubt the existence of political nation, which may speak in a symbolic language of ethnic in Ukraine, we have to deal with the necessity to consolidate on the basis of common values while preserving a diversity of national and religious cultures that Ukraine was likely to acquire as a result of history. Of course, this has to be a matter of close attention on the part of the state and state bodies within the framework of long-term strategy. This was what was overlooked, and I think became a reason for the popularity of pro-Russian views in many regions. Yes, of course, many residents of eastern and other regions of Ukraine do not accept Ukraine, do not view the national symbols as their own. I think that we should go away from the ethnic symbolism of Ukrainian national symbols, and this is the only way, however complicated this may be, that the Ukrainian society has to traverse. It is I regret very much that Ukraine was shuffling its feet on this way, because I think that what has happened now is not just the problem of our neighbors, but the domestic problem of Ukraine, even if the military threat is removed. Whether any cases of hate crimes during the Maidan, yes and no. No, in the statistics that I was quoting, there's not a single case that I would qualify as a race hate crime that took place during Maidan, on Maidan, or from on the part of protest groups that took part there. Even when the anti-Semitic attacks started in January, Maidan was facing repressive disbandment at the moment, because any peaceful protests were put outside the legal field, and even those guys who were painting swastikas on their helmets and shields had other things to do than to persecute Jews. However, we did have some information about attacks during the protest movements, including the right-wing radical groups, on the people whose appearance they did not like. But now I come back to the beginning of our talk. We could not gather enough information because of the information and structural chaos that was taking place here. Yes, I have such information. No, we didn't enter it into statistics. But this is rather the problem of criteria that we formed for ourselves. Any other questions? Thank you very much, and we wish you fruitful work so that we do not see any interethnic conflicts, and first of all, that we do not have conflicts between Ukrainians and Ukrainians, because this, I think, will form the norm of our future. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, not everything depends on me, and the important part of my work is, and of your work, is drawing attention to this problem, which, as I think, is, in spite of the scale of other problems that Ukraine is facing now, is important, is really important as far as the vector of development of Ukrainian society is concerned, and drawing the attention to this problem and putting an accent on the non-rejection and non-avoiding the work in this sphere. So thank you very much for your attention.